What if I told you that your deepest sadness is not a sickness, but a summons? That the heaviness in your chest, the emptiness in your days, and the silence that haunts your nights are not signs of failure, but signs that something ancient within you is stirring? What if the darkness you fear is not your end, but your beginning? What modern minds often label as depression is, in truth, an ancient and sacred journey, a descent into the depths of the psyche. This experience, though harrowing and often misunderstood, is not a pathology in the traditional sense. Rather, it is a threshold event, a profound inner initiation that has been known across cultures and epochs under many names. The dark night of the soul, the underworld journey, the alchemical. This is not merely metaphor, it is an archetypal truth. The feeling of falling apart, of being swallowed by darkness, is not a sign of failure, but a sign that something within has reached its limit. The ego, the constructed self, can no longer bear the weight of denial, repression, or inauthenticity. Something deeper demands to be born. In this descent, the rational mind loses its grip. The usual strategies no longer work. External goals lose their meaning. The world that once felt solid now feels unreal, drained of vitality. This is not dysfunction. It is transformation in its rawest form. The soul is drawing you inward, away from the outer roles and identities you have worn, and into the heart of your own being. You are being called back to yourself, to the ground beneath all persona. But to reach it, you must pass through the darkness. This journey does not occur in straight lines. It is spiralic, chaotic, unpredictable. The descent often begins with subtle discontent, restlessness, fatigue, a growing sense that something is missing. Over time, the discontent deepens, the emotional fog thickens, and a great silence sets in. This silence is not empty. It is full of waiting. Within it lies the soul's demand for attention. What appears to be depressive withdrawal may in fact be the psyche retracting its energy from the world, conserving it for an inward passage that reason cannot chart. It is a time of inner winter, where life retreats underground. Ancient myths understood this well. Inanna descending into the underworld, Orpheus descending for Eurydice, Dante descending into hell. They are not stories of demise, but maps of spiritual rebirth. Each figure must confront loss, shadow, and inner fragmentation. So too must the modern individual, though we lack the cultural framing to honor it. We medicate what we do not understand. We diagnose what we are afraid to feel. But the soul does not obey clinical categories. It speaks a different language, a symbolic, imaginal, emotional language that modernity often forgets. When one descends into the psyche, one meets not only darkness, but buried treasures. Insights arise that could never surface in the brightness of day. A new relationship to truth begins to take form, one no longer shaped by external validation, but by inner necessity. The descent strips away illusion. It reveals what is real, often painfully so. The task is not to escape the darkness, but to endure it, to move through it with openness, to suffer it consciously. This is why the descent is an initiation. It requires surrender, courage, and above all, patience. It is not about fixing the self, but allowing the self to be undone in order to become more whole. The old must die for the new to be born. In this way, the depressive episode becomes a crucible, a place where the ego cracks and the deeper self begins to emerge. To walk this path is not easy. It is often lonely, misunderstood, and feared, but it is also necessary. Because in descending, we reclaim what has been lost: our soul, our depth, our truth. We come to know ourselves not as fragments, but as living wholes. And in time, what once felt like falling becomes the beginning of flight. When one begins the descent into inner darkness, it is not simply the feeling of despair or numbness that emerges. It is the meeting with something long buried, something cast into the unconscious. This presence is known as the shadow. The shadow is not merely what is bad or morally wrong. It is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. It contains not only the dark and shameful aspects, but also the repressed vitality, forgotten potential, and disowned truths of the soul. It is formed from all the parts of ourselves we deemed unacceptable, dangerous, or unworthy, often under the influence of family, society, and culture. In childhood, we quickly learn which emotions and behaviors are welcome and which must be hidden. What cannot be expressed becomes exiled. Over time, these denied parts of the self do not disappear. They live on in the unconscious, waiting. During periods of deep psychological distress, such as what is commonly called depression, the barrier between the conscious self and the unconscious weakens. The shadow rises. It comes not to torment, but to be recognized. However, because it arrives in forms we are unfamiliar with, rage, shame, guilt, envy, despair, it is often misinterpreted as madness or failure. In truth, this confrontation is an invitation. To meet the shadow is to begin the process of becoming whole. It is an encounter that cannot be intellectualized or bypassed. It must be suffered. It must be endured. The shadow does not only carry personal content. It also contains collective elements, archetypal forces that all humans carry. In dreams, it may appear as a threatening figure, a dark double, or a chaotic force. These images are not random. They are expressions of the parts of the psyche that have not yet been integrated. The fear that arises in facing these figures is the ego's resistance to change. The ego wants order, control, consistency. The shadow threatens these. It demands humility. It strips away the illusion of superiority, perfection, or moral clarity. It reveals the truth of our inner contradictions, and it is only by facing this truth that transformation can begin. To embrace the shadow is not to indulge in destructive impulses. It is to accept that we are more than the image we present to the world. It is to recognize that light and darkness live together within us, and that denying one diminishes both. The journey toward wholeness does not mean becoming pure. It means becoming real. When we suppress our shadow, it leaks out unconsciously. It governs our behavior without our awareness. We project it onto others, seeing in them the flaws we refuse to see in ourselves. We judge, attack, resent, because we cannot bear to look within. Depression, then, becomes the soul's refusal to continue this lie. It pulls us inward, forcing us to stop, to feel, to face what we have long ignored. The integration of the shadow is not a single act, but a lifelong process. It requires radical honesty and the courage to sit with discomfort. It is often accompanied by grief, for the parts of ourselves we abandoned, for the years we spent pretending, for the pain we caused by living unconsciously. But it also brings immense vitality. What was once feared becomes a source of power. The raw emotions that once overwhelmed now inform. The darkness becomes fertile ground for insight, creativity, and authentic connection. Depression, in this view, is not the absence of life, but the beginning of deeper life. The shadow comes not to destroy, but to complete. When we turn toward it instead of away, we find within it the very pieces we need to become whole. In the depths of inner suffering, when clarity fades and familiar landmarks vanish, the rational mind loses its authority. In these moments, the unconscious begins to speak in its own native tongue, symbols, images, metaphors, and dreams. This language is not linear or logical. It is fluid, multivalent, and deeply rooted in the oldest layers of the psyche. When the conscious self falters, it is not silence that follows, but the quiet eruption of another voice, one that speaks in the form of inner visions, recurring motifs, strange fantasies, and nighttime messages. These are not symptoms of pathology. They are expressions of meaning. They are the soul's attempts to communicate truths that have no place in the structured language of daily life. Dreams, in particular, are the royal road to the unconscious. They are not random firings of a resting brain, but complex psychic narratives crafted from the material of our deepest inner world. In a time of psychological crisis, dreams often become more vivid, more insistent, more symbolic. They bring forth forgotten memories, personified emotions, and archetypal patterns. A figure chasing you through a forest is not merely a dream. It may represent a truth you are fleeing. A crumbling house may symbolize the breakdown of the ego structure that no longer serves your transformation. A dark cave might be a summons to enter the unconscious and retrieve what has been lost. Each image carries layers of meaning that cannot be interpreted with formulaic tools. They must be engaged with reverently, like sacred texts written in the language of the soul. The unconscious does not offer clarity in the way the intellect demands. It offers images that must be contemplated, lived with, turned over again and again until they begin to reveal their inner movement. This process requires patience. The mind must learn to listen instead of control. It must accept that there are truths which cannot be spoken directly, only shown through symbol. Depression, in this sense, is not just a psychological event but a symbolic state. It is as if the light of day withdraws so that the inner eye can open. The soul has turned inward, not to escape life, but to prepare for a new relationship with it. In this turning, the imagination becomes the bridge. What we imagine, we do not invent, we uncover. Active imagination, the deliberate engagement with dream images and inner figures, becomes a tool for dialogue with the unconscious. Rather than passively observing, one participates in the unfolding of inner stories. The sad figure in a dream may be spoken to. The wild animal may be followed deeper into the forest. This dialogue is not fantasy. It is a conscious descent into the depths, where unknown aspects of the self begin to take form. It is a collaboration between the conscious and the unconscious, an alchemical vessel in which the fragments of the self begin to rearrange themselves into new configurations. The symbols that arise are not to be interpreted once and discarded. They are living presences, and their meanings evolve over time. A serpent may first appear as fear, later as wisdom. Fire may seem destructive, then regenerative. The richness of symbolic language lies in its refusal to be reduced. It resists the cold clarity of diagnostic labels and instead invites inner participation. What begins as confusion becomes a path. What was once frightening becomes meaning. Through this symbolic dialogue, the depression is transformed. It no longer appears as a meaningless void, but as a dark womb in which something is forming. The suffering is not empty, it is the vessel of becoming. In learning to read the language of the unconscious, one steps into a deeper mode of knowing, one that honors mystery and allows the soul to reveal itself in its own time through its own symbols. There comes a point in the descent into inner darkness when one begins to feel the erosion of all that was once stable. The identities that once defined you, student, professional, child, parent, achiever, start to crack and fall away. The things you pursued no longer hold meaning. What once excited now feels empty. What once gave a sense of self now feels like a costume. This disintegration is not collapse for its own sake, but the beginning of a deeper process, the unfolding of the true self. Beneath the layers of conditioning and expectation lies a core essence, something authentic that has been waiting to emerge. The pain that accompanies this unraveling is not a sign of failure, but a necessary part of a greater transformation. It is the process known as individuation. Individuation is not the pursuit of perfection or enlightenment. It is the slow and often painful work of becoming who you truly are, not who others want you to be, not who you have pretended to be, and not even who you imagined yourself to be. It is the return to a deeper alignment with the self that has always been present, though buried under years of adaptation. The suffering that emerges in depression can be understood as the psyche's protest against a life lived inauthentically. The soul begins to withdraw its energy from a way of being that no longer supports growth, forcing a confrontation with the parts of oneself that have been ignored or denied. This confrontation is often uncomfortable, even terrifying. It means facing the void left behind by the loss of the familiar self. But within that void is the space necessary for something new to grow. The false self, the ego that was constructed to survive, to please, to fit in, cannot contain the fullness of the soul, and so it breaks. And in the breaking, a deeper self begins to stir. This emergence is not loud or dramatic. It often begins as a whisper, a quiet sense of longing, a vague but insistent feeling that there is more to you than the roles you have played. Individuation is the response to that inner call. The journey inward reveals that the self is not a static thing, but a living process. It unfolds in layers, in stages, in rhythms. It is not achieved by striving, but by listening. The psyche begins to reorient itself not around external goals, but internal truths. One begins to live not according to scripts, but according to inner necessity. This often means stepping away from what is expected or accepted, choosing solitude over conformity, silence over noise. It requires the courage to say no when others expect yes, to stop when the world demands forward motion. It is an act of profound honesty, and with honesty comes discomfort, because it upends the narratives that kept life orderly. Individuation is not a rejection of the world, but a re-engagement with it from a place of depth. As the false layers fall away, the individual discovers a sense of self that is grounded, resilient, and unique. This self does not seek approval, because it knows its own worth. It does not fear the unknown, because it has walked through the unknown within. Depression, in this context, becomes the soul's way of initiating the process. It strips away illusion, forces introspection, and demands a new relationship with the self. It is not a flaw to be fixed, but a transition to be honored. The journey may be lonely, but it leads to authenticity, and authenticity is the foundation of a life that is not only bearable, but meaningful. The self that emerges through individuation is no longer a fragment, it is a whole. When one is seized by inner turmoil, what is often labeled as depression, the ordinary channels of thought, logic, and explanation begin to fail. The rational mind, accustomed to categorizing and controlling, grows silent in the presence of deep psychic pain. What emerges in that silence is not mere emptiness, but a different form of intelligence, one rooted not in analysis, but in image, symbol, and feeling. This is the realm of the imagination, not as fantasy or escapism, but as a vital function of the psyche, a bridge between the conscious self and the unconscious depths. It is through this imaginative faculty that healing begins to take shape. The imagination, in its true form, is not an escape from reality, but a deepening of it. When the soul is in crisis, it speaks not through facts, but through images. These images arise spontaneously, in dreams, in sudden visions, in creative impulses, in symbolic thoughts that seem to arrive unbidden. They often carry with them emotion, intensity, and meaning far beyond what words can express. They come not from the outside world, but from within, from a deeper center that the conscious ego may not yet know. This is the language of the soul, and to ignore it is to remain in exile from one's inner life. In times of psychic darkness, one may find oneself drawing strange figures, writing fragments of poetry, imagining dialogues with unknown presences, or becoming fascinated with certain symbols or myths. These are not distractions. They are the psyche's attempt to express what cannot yet be consciously known. Depression may take away interest in the outer world, precisely to redirect attention inward, to make space for these imaginative acts. What may appear as idleness or detachment is often the beginning of a sacred engagement. Through imagination, one starts to make visible what has been hidden. Active imagination, a conscious dialogue with these inner images, becomes a powerful method of engaging with the unconscious. One does not interpret or analyze the image at first, but allows it to unfold. If a dark figure appears in a dream, one may return to it in waking life, not to dismiss it, but to speak with it, to ask why it has come, to observe how it behaves. This process is not childish. It is an ancient and essential method of soul work. In giving voice to the inner figures, one begins to understand the parts of the self that have long gone unheard. The critic, the wounded child, the wise old man, the wild animal, each has something to say. Each holds a key to deeper integration. The act of engaging creatively with the inner world is not indulgence. It is healing. Through drawing, writing, movement, or storytelling, the unconscious is allowed to express itself in a way the conscious mind can witness and respond to. This relationship between the ego and the deep psyche brings forth a new kind of knowledge, one that does not solve problems in a linear fashion, but transforms the inner landscape altogether. The pain that once felt meaningless begins to acquire shape. Suffering is given form, and in being shaped, it becomes something that can be held, understood, even honored. Imagination is the vessel through which transformation moves. It takes the raw material of suffering and renders it into a process. It reveals what was hidden in shadow, and it grants access to the symbolic truths that lie beneath the surface of our daily identities. In depression, when the outer world seems gray and inert, the imagination opens doors to the inner realm where new life begins. The images that arise may be strange, uncomfortable, even frightening, but they are alive. They are the signs that something in the soul is stirring, reaching for expression, searching for wholeness. In the grip of what is commonly named depression, time stretches. Days blur together. The outer world loses color, meaning, and rhythm. One may feel immobilized, as though suspended in a state between death and life. Nothing seems to move forward. But within this standstill, something ancient is occurring. The soul is undergoing a process that does not conform to the clock or the calendar. It operates in kairos, not chronos, in sacred time, not mechanical time. What appears to be stagnation is, at its death, a period of incubation. The silence, the slowness, the retreat from the external world, all are necessary for an inner gestation that cannot be rushed. In modern society, there is little tolerance for stillness. Movement, productivity, and constant growth are the ideals. Even suffering is expected to be efficient, a few sessions, a prescription, a return to normalcy. But the soul does not heal on demand. It cannot be ordered back into performance. It must descend, wander, rest, and transform in its own rhythm. Depression, then, becomes the soul's rebellion against forced momentum. It is a breaking of the mechanical clock in favor of something more organic, more cyclical. It demands that we stop, not to give up, but to be still long enough to truly listen. What feels like being lost is often the beginning of being found. During this time, there is often a temptation to rush the process, to fix, to solve, to force oneself back into functioning. But the deeper movement resists such pressure. The soul requires space, space to grieve, to reflect, to shed, and to wait. This waiting is not passive. It is a kind of alchemy. In the darkness, something old is dissolving and something new is forming. But the process is invisible, like seeds beneath the soil, or a chrysalis hanging in quiet transformation. The signs of change are hidden. From the outside, nothing seems to be happening, but inside, the old structures are breaking down, and new patterns are preparing to emerge. To endure this stage is to practice radical patience. Not the patience of endurance alone, but the patience of reverence, the understanding that one is in the presence of something sacred. The ego, which thrives on control and progress, suffers in this space. It wants clarity, direction, resolution. But the soul speaks in another tone, one that unfolds in dreams, subtle shifts in feeling, unexpected insights that cannot be summoned at will. These moments arrive when the time is right, not when the ego decides. Depression slows life down enough to make room for this deeper unfolding. The discomfort of slowness is part of the process. As the psyche rests in this cocoon, fragments begin to gather. The pieces of the self that were scattered, denied, or forgotten are drawn inward. The silence allows their voices to be heard. The darkness gives them shelter. This is the secret gift of stillness. It gathers what was lost. It does not eliminate pain, but it creates the space in which pain can speak its truth. Over time, this truth reshapes the self, not through grand revelations, but through the quiet work of presence and attention. What seemed like emptiness becomes fullness. What was unbearable becomes meaningful. In the deep, slow rhythm of soul time, healing reveals itself, not as a return to the old self, but as the emergence of a new one. The inner winter, so long and barren, begins to stir with faint signs of spring. A thought that feels lighter, a dream that carries hope, a small desire to create, to connect, to live again, not out of obligation, but from a place of truth. These are not sudden transformations. They arrive gently, naturally, without fanfare. The stillness has done its work. The soul, honored in its own time, begins to rise, not as it was, but as it was always meant to be. So, when the weight presses heavy and the world recedes into shadow, do not be so quick to call it brokenness. What you name as depression may be the soul withdrawing its energy from a life no longer aligned with its truth. What appears as despair may in truth be a descent, a sacred, painful journey into the depths where the lost pieces of the self await. This darkness is not your enemy. It is your initiation. The images that rise, the shadow that confronts, the silence that unnerves, all are elements of a deeper movement, the awakening of your true self. You are not failing. You are being undone so that you may be remade, not in the image of the world, but in the pattern of your own soul. The suffering asks not for explanation, but for reverence. The path asks not for speed, but for patience. The psyche does not speak in commands, but in symbols. And within those symbols, in the darkness you would rather escape, lies the very meaning you have been searching for. This is not depression. This is the sacred alchemy of awakening. Trust it. Walk with it. And one day the darkness will open, not to reveal the old light, but a new one, born from within.